Everyone, welcome back to part 2 here of stabbing in position as a preflop caller in a 3-bet pot. We just learned more about button versus small blind, stabbing the flop on 7-6-3 two-toned. We're now going to continue with our turn strategy after we get check called on the flop by the small blind. Okay, so the board is 7-6-3 two-toned here. The small blind did check call our flop. And first, let's look into his turn strategy out of position after check calling. There are, of course, different turn transitions possible here. And we can see that the small blind does have a low frequency lead, around 10% or so. So it's very, very marginal. But I do want to mention it quickly that on some of the ace-x turns as well as the 3x, our opponent does have incentive to lead a couple of hands in his range. Obviously, the aces is a pretty strong card. He will often improve to, for example, top set there, which makes him inclined to do have a leading range there. Also, the 3x, possible a good card with all his overpairs now ahead against, for example, a 7-6. And also, there are still a lot of draws possible within our opponent's range. So he could have reasons to lead there. As mentioned, frequencies are very low, around 10% or so. So if you would check your entire range, it's totally fine as well. But you could find reasons to do have an implemented bull. You do have reasons to also lead a couple of turns here, and those are these cards. We're checking the rest of our range here in the small blind after check calling. And we're moving on to the turn double barrel for us in position. SPR is 2 here after we bet the flop for 1/3 sizing. The pot is now $20. We have around $40 left. And we're going to look into a few different turn transitions here. We're going to look into flush card, a pairing card, a blank, and a nut changing straight card. We're going to talk about sizing choices as well as strategical outcomes and some takeaways. First things first, let's look into a flush turn card here. So we did stab the flop, our opponent check calls, and now the queen of spades rolls off. On the top part of the window here, you can see all the flush cards listed. And I ran the same with 3 sizings, a 34%, a 66%, and a pot size sizing. And you can see that on all these flush cards, we are exclusively betting small, 1/3 pot here. I choose 34% here because that leaves exactly SPR1 on the river, which makes us able to shove the river. So we're betting small, and on the right side, you can see the equity graph of this. And what you see in the equity graph here is that both ranges are extremely equal here on the top end of the ranges. So we both have quite a bit of nut flushes, second nut flushes. Here you can see that on the top section of the range. But in the middle part of the ranges, we are extremely favorable, or we are a lot ahead versus our opponent's range. We are the red line here versus the blue line, and we hold a big advantage there. So that makes us willing to bet a little bit smaller here on this somewhat static turn as well. Because if we bet, we want to get value with like these hands in the middle versus our opponent's hands there in below our range, basically. And if we bet too big, all those hands can, of course, find an easy fold, and that's not necessarily the highest EV option for us. So we are planning to bet a little bit smaller, 1/3 pot here. We're betting on this specific turn 46% of our range, but you can see the majority of these turns listed on the top right here, or on the top end here. Okay, so if you look at some outcomes here on this turn, we can see that every flush that we have that is 10 high or higher is basically always betting here. 8 high flushes and lower are mainly checking always. We're protecting our checking range with some of the lowest flushes, but it's not necessarily protecting our check back range. It's just that our hand has higher EV checking. We don't really want to bet and get check raised here. And therefore, we are slowing down here with our lowest flushes, and we're using them to call down very often on river runouts. The 9 high flush draw here is very much in between, and it's splitting sort of 50-50 here. We're betting straights very often here, especially if they unblock higher straight draws or ace-x hands here in our opponent's range. So if we don't have a straight draw, it's more likely that our opponent could have, for example, a straight draw here and not a flush. And obviously, if we have a straight, we want to make it not very likely that our opponent does have a flush, because then we're value cutting ourselves. We don't want to do that. So we want to make it more likely that he has, for example, straight draws, sometimes even a pair or two pair, aces that could potentially go check call again on some of the runouts. So we don't want to have those cards in our range. We want to bet sets extremely often here. They have very strong potential going to rivers, of course, because sets can improve on board pairing rivers, and therefore we have a lot of nutted equity going to the river. We're going to check most of our two pair hands here because they have much less nutted equity basically going to the river. Improvement potential is lower, and we want to play them much more carefully there. High flush blockers here, we're betting extremely often. Think, of course, about the ace of spades, the king of spades, even the jack and the 10 of spades are betting with a very high frequency here in the hope to take down the pot and make our opponent fold. If we look into turn transitions going for a pairing turn here, we look into a 7 of clubs this time. You can see on the top end of the window here all the pairing turns, and you can see that it's interesting. At least that was on my part interesting. I would thought that we generally lean towards a smaller bet sizing here, but we're actually almost exclusively going for 2/3 pot here. You can see it in this column basically, and we're not that interested in betting small here. You can see we have a large advantage here in our range on this card, for example, the 7 of clubs. We have a polarized advantage here in the top end of our range, and we this time don't really have that mid-range advantage. So we have less reasons to bet extremely small and more reasons to go a little bit larger, in this time 66%. Okay, 2/3 pot is our preferred sizing here. We bet 61% on this specific turn. We're betting trips or better always here on this turn run out. We're betting extremely often with a 6x blocker here. We're betting almost always with 4s and 5s, blocking the nut straight at this point. If we have a 3x in this situation, so the bottom pair, we need some additional blockers to justify betting because the blocker value is less strong basically. So we need to add something, some components to it to justify betting. For example, a 4, a 5 is a good blocker. High spades, of course, maybe a pair of 8s or 9s to have some blockers to our opponent's combo draws he could continue with, and also holding some nutted equity going to the river. So those are important to think about when we bet 3x here. And we want to bet your best flush draws and the weakest flush draws with additional blockers and no showdown value. Obviously, we're betting the very strongest flush draws here, so nut flush draws in combinations with strong overpairs or with a pair blocker or with combo draws. We're mainly betting those hands. We're also betting some of the weakest flush draws that have additional blockers. These hands, they don't really benefit too much from taking a free card, especially if they hold, like, for example, a 4 or a 5 in the hand. So increasement of fold equity and no showdown value at that point. That makes us willing to bet rather than check. 4x, 5x, bet more often without showdown value while blocking ace x or king x. So if we have a 4 or a 5, no showdown value at all, we generally want to bet a little bit more if we have an ace or a king. Because if we block ace x or king x, those hands, aces and kings, are a high frequency check call on the flop and also a check call on the turn by our opponent. So if we block ace x or king x, we make it more likely our opponent could find a fold on the turn, and therefore that's favorable, of course, if we take a bluffing stab with 4x or 5x. Let's look into the next section here, which would be a blank turn with a backdoor flush draw. This is a dynamic turn, of course. A lot of draws come in here, SPR2, and therefore we have no incentive to bet small, but go for an extremely large sizing, in this instance pot. You can see it here running sims on all the backdoor flush draw blanks. Here you can see that we are mixing between 66 and full pot. generally leaning a little bit more towards full pot. So simplifying it to a full pot strategy is fine, and it doesn't leave you any EV on the table. I ran sims for different sizings here, multiple sizings, and we see that the difference is extremely minimal. So simplifying it to a pot size sizing here on these dynamic turns with a backdoor flush draw is totally fine. Remember that if the turn would be a backdoor, if the turn would be a blank without a backdoor flush draw, the sizing preference leans a little bit more towards 2/3 pot versus full pot. So backdoor flush draw is an important element and changes pot versus 2/3 slightly. Full pot is preferred. We are betting around 48% of our range here. Simplified to one size only with a minimal EV loss, just mentioned it. And on blanks without a backdoor flush, we prefer to bet like 2/3 pots a little bit more. Here we're betting our best made hands, of course. Wake's clear, no problems, of course, for all of you. And we're betting our strongest draws, especially another draws, combo draws, a combination of those. The best combo draws that have, for example, a pair blocker to the board. All those kind of hands that can simply bet and stack off are often justified to go for a bet. Two pairs here after betting the flop. At this point, they need additional equity and or blockers to bet, because otherwise we just don't do very well against the check raising range by our opponent here. So we should be careful there, not betting any two pair here. And flush draws check often unless stacking multiple components. So flush draws, obviously many of those do want to bet, but they do need additional components to bet. Bare flush draws are often just checking because the board is so dynamic here. It makes it more likely our opponent could find a continue here because there are so many draws available. And we're also betting full pot, so we are investing quite a bit of money here. Therefore, we should be more selective with our bets, of course. So combination of multiple components here makes us willing to go for a bet. Straight draws here on a board like this, we're not betting them. The board is way too dynamic. Our opponent will continue enough. We're dominated by a lot of draws in our opponent's continuing range, so we're going to check them and hope to improve on the river. We're not willing here to invest this much money with a straight draw at this point. Lastly, nut changing straight turns. So the nut straight on the flop, of course, is 4 or 5, but there are a lot of nut changing straights here on the turn possible. I listed them here on top, and you can see that on this turn there's a mix between small and 2/3, but generally 1/3 pot is used more often here. You can see that here is the graph again. We are pretty equal in the top of our range, and we hold quite a big of an advantage here in this section of the board. It's interesting here to see again going for small, setting up this SPR1 situation on the river. 1/3 pot is preferred. We're betting 78% of the time with our range on this specific turn, for example. But most of these straight turns are pretty good for our range. They connect very well with our pre-flop range as well as with our stabbing range on the flop. On higher board textures, for example, 10-9-7 two-toned here, we can see that we generally prefer to bet a little bit larger on a straightening turn. That is because that board interacts better with our opponent's range, and therefore we are less incentivized to bet small and make it more easy for our opponent to continue. Okay, we're going to bet our best made hands here, of course. We're going to check the third nuts here at this point, which is 4x, 4 or 5, extremely often here. 2 pair without backup plus an 8 are also checking very often here. Let's see, 2 pair without backup and an ace. Yeah, so the weakest 2 pairs basically are also checking at this point. We're betting all our blockers. If you think about 10s, 8s, 5s, and 4s, like all those hands we want to just put into our betting range and put pressure on our opponent here and leverage the positional advantage here by betting small here and then setting up an SPR1 reverse situation with our blockers. And generally we bluff more when we don't block the ace here and when we have the 8 or a 5. So obviously the 8 is a great blocker here. The 5 is a great blocker here as well. And on this specific turn, we don't necessarily want to have the ace in comparison to a previous previous card. And the reason here is if we don't have the ace, it's more likely our opponent has the ace, of course. And aces have more problems continuing on this turn when facing a stab than, for example, on a pairing turn that we just saw. But if we do have the ace this time here, it's much more likely that our opponent does have a rundown this time that actually does connect fairly well to this 9, for example, with like a 10-9-8 combination or something like that. So in this instance, we want our opponent to have the ace. So always think about like the turn texture and whether we do benefit from having the ace or not, and that it depends a lot on the turn transition. But again, obviously, the 8 or the 5 are great blockers here. Okay, those were 4 runouts for different turn transitions here. The final notes, we are betting small on the flushes and the nut changing straights. We're betting 2/3 pot on the pairing turns. Remember that we're not as incentivized here to bet very small, which probably many of us will do. And we bet very large on the dynamic backdoor flush draws. You want to always consider how much blocker value does your hand have? How much showdown value do you have? In other words, like how beneficial is it for you to check back and go to showdown? Or does betting basically give you more EV, and do you benefit from pushing out your opponent here? Of course, equity is important here, especially with the strong hands and the medium strong hands. Like how beneficial is it to build a pot here, and how nutted are you with some of your components going to the river? Okay, that is turn action for this point. I hope you enjoyed this video. There are definitely some interesting takeaways here, especially also when it comes to sizing and different transitions here. I hope you enjoyed that one. We're going to move to river in the next episode. See you there. Make sure to check it out. My name is Luke for the PLO Master.